Thank you very much for the introduction and also for being here. Thank you for the other talks. It was super interesting to me. As I'm not as spontaneous as the others, I will give a more classical talk and then we'll start right away. In its most fundamental dimension, the question of scientific realism is a metaphysical question about the mind, or generally human independent existence of the world investigated by the sciences, and thus tightly connected to questions of epistemology, such as scientific objectivity. Scientific realists assume such an independent existence and claim that the sciences contribute to its discovery, while anti-realists dispute this to varying degrees and in different ways. Metaphysics, however, has always been a contested endeavor in philosophy, not only as the battlefield of endless controversies, as Kant said, but also as a discipline on the whole. While some have crowned metaphysics as the queen of the sciences, others have banished it from philosophy as unscientific nonsense, conceding its right to exist at most as an expression of a Lebensgefühl. One reason for the great intricacy of metaphysics was and still is that disagreements about substantial metaphysical claims and positions often go hand in hand with meta-theoretical disagreements about its scope or definition, its method, and the meaningfulness of its questions in the first place. The problem is that there is no non-metaphysical ultimate standpoint which leads to a tricky entanglement of substantive metaphysical statements or positions with methodological controversies, and which is also one of the reasons for the often endless, even viciously circular character of metaphysical questions. While strictly speaking, there is no way out of this kind of vicious circle, reflecting on this aporia as such shows that in a less strict sense, it seems at least possible to consider the form of this discussion from a meta-theoretical level. In other words, given the knottiness of this discourse, it seems advisable to precede the adoption of a position within the antagonism of scientific realism and anti-realisms with a reflection on what it means on a meta-theoretical level to adopt a position here, that is, what meta-theoretical claims one makes on a realist or anti-realist position. One important development in the more recent scientific realism debates in the mainstream analytic tradition is indeed an increased awareness of such meta-theoretical considerations, concomitant with a methodological reflection which becomes manifest in a different conception of the nature and claim of the respective positions in the debate, that is, scientific realism and the various forms of scientific anti-realism. Rather than regarding scientific realism and anti-realisms themselves as epistemic or scientific theories or beliefs which could be defended, for example, by quasi-empirical arguments and claimed to be true, it has become common to refer to these different positions as value-laden stances, frameworks, or attitudes, which are to be assessed largely in terms of their pragmatic benefits. Parallel to this development in mainstream analytic philosophy in late 20th century, however, the question of scientific realism was also discussed by feminist philosophers of science such as Donna Haraway and Val Plumwood, who have argued even further that the question of scientific realism, far from being either a scientific empirical question or an idle armchair speculation, has a particular political relevance. In the following, I will first trace this meta-theoretical development in broad strokes and discuss the view that the positions in the scientific realism debate are stances that are to be assessed in pragmatic terms. I will argue that this pragmatic approach is neither epistemically nor politically and ethically a satisfactory basis for the relationship between science and the world. I will then turn to Haraway's and Plumwood's feminist accounts to address the political meaning of the scientific realism debate. By combining the advantages of the meta-theoretical stance view with the substantial insights gained from feminist analysis of the realism debate, I will conclude that firstly, the relevance of the realism debate as such is based on its political meaning, and that thus secondly, positions within the realism anti-realism spectrum should be understood as an outgrowth of political attitudes. Since I tried to bring two very different philosophical traditions into dialogue with each other in this talk, there will inevitably be inaccuracies and oversimplifications on the one hand, and on the other hand, a few terminological remarks must be made in advance. What I refer to here as the scientific realism debate in mainstream Anglophone analytic philosophy is a specific discourse that evolved in the course of the 20th century in engagement with, and as reaction to, logical empiricism, mainly concerned with the ontological status of unobservables in physics, sometimes chemistry insofar as it is related to physics. That is, the question of whether or in what sense such unobservable entities that are typically posited by scientific theories to explain certain observable phenomena and empirical laws exist or are real, or conversely, whether scientific theories that include terms for unobservable entities have a factual reference on and are to be understood literally or as mere syntactical instruments. Within this discourse, scientific realists are accordingly those who think that unobservables exist or are real, while scientific anti-realists, for instance, empiricists, contest this. The prevailing form of the scientific realism debate in this tradition in the late 20th century was a naturalistic one, dominated in particular by two influential arguments. We heard that before: the so-called no miracle argument in defense of scientific realism and the so-called pessimistic meta-induction against scientific realism. Although they defend opposing positions in terms of content, both arguments have some striking similarities on a meta-theoretical formal level, insofar as both presuppose that scientific realism is itself a natural scientific theory, which can therefore be argued for or against on the basis of quasi-empirical methods. The no miracle argument is mostly known in the form of Hilary Putnam presented it in order to defend a realism of scientific theories. The positive argument for realism is that it is the only philosophy that doesn't make the success of science a miracle. That terms in mature scientific theories typically refer that the theories accepted in mature science are typically approximately true, that the same term can refer to the same thing even if it occurs in different theories. These statements are viewed by the scientific realist not as necessary truth, but as part of the only scientific explanation of the success of science, and hence as part of any adequate scientific description of science and its relation to its objects. There are several often remarked issues with this argument. To name just a few, firstly, the no miracle argument presupposes that the success of science is an empirical phenomenon in need of an empirical scientific explanation provided by a realist view of science, which already begs the question. As Van Fraassen has pointed out in a Darwinist move, it is hardly surprising that our theories are successful, since only successful theories survive in the course of scientific history. Concomitant with the supposed need for an empirical explanation for the success of science, secondly, the argument uses the quasi-empirical method of abduction or inference to the best explanation for a metaphysical question, thereby presupposing a realist view of these methods, which it is supposed to argue for. Ooh.
Here you go.
Hence, as even convinced scientific realists such as Psillos acknowledges, the no miracle argument works within the realist framework. It is not an argument for it. In his detailed critique of the no miracle argument, Laudin remarked that once one concedes that epistemic doctrines are to be tested in the court of experience, it is possible that one's favored epistemic theories may be refuted rather than confirmed. He goes on to give a list of historical theories that give evidence that Putnam's assumed link between the success of science and the factual reference of scientific theories does not hold. Laudin's argument often serves as the basis for the so-called pessimistic meta-induction against scientific realism, which Chakravarti rephrased as follows. Consider the history of scientific theories in any particular domain. From the perspective of the present, most past theories are considered false, strictly speaking. There is evidence of severe discontinuity over time regarding both the entities and processes described. This evidence makes up a catalogue of instability in the things to which theories refer. By induction based on these past cases, it is likely that present-day theories are also false and will be recognized as such in the future. Similar to the no miracle argument, the pessimistic meta-induction considers the question of scientific realism an empirical matter and uses induction to argue against scientific realism. And likewise, the arguments against the pessimistic meta-induction concern problems of induction more generally, as well as its quasi-empirical form. The putative failure of reference on the part of past successful theories cannot be used to derive a conclusion regarding the chances that our current best theories do not refer to unobservables, as Chakravarti states. Moreover, and of course, if the pessimistic meta-induction is itself an empirical theory, it is, according to its own statement, likely to turn out false in future. In short, the problems with both the no miracle argument and the pessimistic meta-induction face problems concerning empirical methodologies in general, but more importantly, the vicious circularity of the arguments lies in their naturalistic form more fundamentally, that is, in their use of quasi-empirical, quasi-scientific methods in order to justify or defeat the validity, truth, or adequacy, short, the metaphysical objectivity of science in the first place. In other words, the problem with this naturalistic form is that the kind of justification that exists within science cannot be used for justifying science, since such methodological incest necessarily leads to argumentative deformities. In response to these issues, the form of the scientific realism debate in mainstream Anglophone analytic philosophy changed, as Boucher and Forbes noted, by taking a pragmatic turn. While the debate in its naturalistic form was concerned with determining which position is true, warranted, correct, or most rational, the pragmatic scientific realism debate, by contrast, can be thought of as being concerned with determining which positions best serve certain values, that is useful, preferable, prudent, or most practical. Although the pragmatic turn consists in a cluster of claims and approaches rather than one single doctrine, Boucher and Forbes detect two central themes which are independent of one another, but both involve rejecting the naturalistic, quasi-scientific methodology behind the no miracle argument and the pessimistic meta-induction. The first view within the pragmatic turn is the characterization of scientific realism or its anti-realist alternatives as stances rather than theories or beliefs. Stance, realism, and anti-realism should be construed as, or as closely related to, perhaps a function or outgrowth of, stances or frameworks, and thus their justifications are heavily value-laden. The idea of a stance as solution to the problems of the naturalistic form of the scientific realism debate was introduced by Van Frassen. By doing so, he wanted to emphasize that a philosophical position can consist in something other than a belief in what the world is like. The alternative is, as he says, a stance, attitude, commitment, or approach, which can be expressed and which may involve or presuppose some beliefs as well, but not ones that are unpalatable to someone taking that stance. The important difference between scientific realism as a belief in what the world is like and as a stance is that a stance in this sense embodies the acceptance that all justifications for the adoption or rejection of scientific realism will need to ultimately find their grounding in some already held set of values, and that we will therefore never be able to conclusively establish what the rational choice is per se, as Boucher and Forbes write. In other words, the adoption of a stance or framework in the scientific realism debate is a matter of choice, where this choice is informed by an agent's values rather than by reasons, empirical facts, or evidence. This choice can be rational only relative to the values and likely practical consequences of the chosen stance in the specific context over another stance, but there is no rational choice as for a stance per se. Accordingly, the pragmatic turn, as discerned by Boucher and Forbes, further involves a pragmatic rather than a naturalistic justification. Pragmatic justification, realism and anti-realism, or the stances or frameworks with which they are closely associated, are to be assessed in large part in terms of the pragmatic benefits of adopting them given agent relative goals, values, and practical context. In explicating the pragmatic benefits of adopting either a realist or anti-realist framework, pragmatic justification also reveals the practical significance of the whole scientific realism debate. That is, pragmatic justification also reveals why the adoption of a realist or anti-realist stance matters at all. Although both components of the pragmatic turn, stance and pragmatic justification, are independent of one another, Boucher and Forbes argue that they are strongest together. Stance and pragmatic justification on their own embody at best partial, incomplete moves away from the traditional conception of the scientific realism debate. Stance provides a framework for understanding why the adoption of scientific realism or its alternatives cannot be grounded objectively for all rational agents by quasi-scientific appeals to the facts, but only for individual rational agents by appealing to their antecedently held values. Pragmatic justification provides the drive to investigate the details of that grounding relationship to help people determine whether scientific realism is right for them, even if it's not right for everyone. Not so surprisingly, Boucher and Forbes cite themselves here as ones who set good examples by endorsing both views. For instance, in his thesis, A Pragmatic Existentialist Approach to the Scientific Realism Debate, Forbes combines both views characteristic of the pragmatic turn in order to develop a conceptual framework that is sensitive to different people having irreducibly different values informing their stance choices, and that, as he writes, different stances could thus be rational for different people or even the same people in different practical contexts. While this seems to be a rather modest claim, Forbes ultimately suggests that the way forward for the right realism debate is to try to show that someone is more likely to achieve specific ends in a specific context if they adopt one stance rather than another, even if they are epistemically equally rational. The pragmatic turn thus seems to have the meta-theoretical advantage over the discussed naturalistic approaches that it does not or not necessarily entangle in self-contradictions. However, I think there are several issues with the pragmatic turn. First, in the form put forward by Forbes, the pragmatic turn involves a justification of a stance in terms of the ends that are likely to be achieved by its adoption without having to justify the chosen end itself. According to this view, a stance is a rational choice for an individual agent whenever it suits or supports that very agent's values and goals. The pragmatic escape from self-contradictions thus endorses a potentially dangerous value relativism, where a certain position can be justified purely instrumentally, no matter what the respective values and ends are, whether they are epistemically accountable or ethically legitimate. This may be acceptable if we frame the scientific realism debate in the narrow sense where it only concerns the existence of unobservable entities and physics. But what about realist or anti-realist stances in biology? Take a biologist with conservative or anti-trans values who wants to naturalize his binary gender norms. This agent may find it pragmatically useful to adopt a realist stance toward a supposed biological essentialist foundation of gender, say in the chromosomes. Even though current research does not support such simple essentialist models, a pragmatic justification could still render this stance rational insofar as it serves the agent's epistemic ends and political values. Likewise, in climate science, an agent could adopt an anti-realist stance towards theoretical entities such as the climate point of no return, which could be pragmatically justified if the goal is, for instance, to question the validity of the respective climate model as basis for climate politics. This is neither epistemically nor politically and ethically a satisfactory basis for the relationship between science, scientists, and the world. Boucher and Forbes' pragmatic turn approach allows realism or anti-realism to be described as rational as soon as they correspond to the values and goals of an individual agent. Since the ends and values themselves are not evaluated normatively and are also linked to agents understood in individualistic terms, the approach can legitimize epistemically harmful and politically dangerous positions, especially in sciences with strong social relevance such as biology, social science, and medicine. As Haraway stressed, science has to insist on better accounts of the world, both epistemically and ethically or politically. Drawing on feminist philosophies of science in the following, I will address the political meaning of the question of scientific realism. As hinted at in the beginning, outside of the mainstream analytical tradition, the question of scientific realism is often framed in broader terms as the question of, roughly speaking, whether, as Elgin writes, the scientists draw the lines or discover where nature draws them. Scientific realists are accordingly those who believe that science contributes to the discovery, that is, the description, representation, or explanation of the things, order, and structure of the world, nature, reality, largely independent of us humans, while scientific anti-realists contest this claim, at least in part and in various respects. The biggest difference to debate in the legacy of logical empiricism is that the distinction between realism and anti-realism is not based on the reductionist empiricist criterion of observability. Rather, in the broader debate, realists and anti-realists disagree on whether or in what sense the entities, theories, or facts established by science exist independently from the mind, language, or more generally human constructions. Accordingly, there are several versions of anti-realism contesting this independence, but in the following I will focus on the currently most influential one, which is social constructivism. Given that this broader debate is about independence rather than observability, the term real can be misleading and often led to a common misunderstanding. An anti-realist in this broader debate might stress that, for instance, sex is socially constructed rather than a human independent fact, but that does not mean that it is in any sense less real. But let's have a look at Haraway's analysis of the scientific realism debate. Her starting point in situated knowledges is the question of scientific objectivity as a question where epistemological and metaphysical issues are tightly entangled. Haraway famously criticizes objectivity as a view from nowhere as God trick, which he imputes to the totalizing validity claims of scientific realism, according to which science can produce undistorted representations of the world. At the same time, she emphasizes that it is not enough to simply point to the historical contingency and construction of all knowledge as anti-realist radical social constructivists do. For this runs the risk of an all-equalizing relativism. That is, relativism ultimately is also God trick with universalist claims insofar as it is a way of being nowhere while claiming to be everywhere equally, as she writes. By insisting that ethics and politics provide the basis for objectivity in the science as a heterogeneous whole, Harvey's aim is to develop a philosophy of science that undermines the politically dangerous universalizing tendency she identifies in both scientific realism and radical social constructivism. Given that her starting point is the question of scientific objectivity, Harvey analyzes the question of scientific realism as one about the relation between science and its objects of knowledge in the broadest sense, that is, the world or nature, and she criticizes the dualistic conception of this relation. Dualisms, in this sense, are binary hierarchical conceptual oppositions in which one part is conceived as original and superior, the other as derivative of the former and inferior. Examples of these are true-false, active-passive, reason-feeling, subject-object, human-animal or human nature, and culture or science versus nature, and man-woman. For her, scientific realism and anti-realism in the form of social constructivism are different articulations of such a dualistic conception between science and nature in the broad sense of a surrounding as it is investigated by various sciences. While according to the realist view, nature is a passive resource whose properties and laws are discovered and epistemically appropriated by scientists, according to the radical constructivist view, humans produce nature culturally and scientifically so that beyond human construction, it seems to be nothing but a blank page for social inscriptions. According to Harvey, both approaches suffer from a productionist way of thinking, especially in relation to nature or the world as an object of knowledge. Productionism and its corollary humanism come down to the storyline that man makes everything, including himself, out of the world that can only be resource and potency to his project and active agency. Such a productionist logic seems inescapable in traditions of Western binarisms. Indeed, it can also be understood as their political significance unproblematic. More specifically, the political problematic of Western dualisms is that they do not simply represent the indifferent marks of differences, dichotomies, or conceptual distinctions. Ecofeminist Val Plumwood has pointed this out in more detail with respect to the living nature, be that our ecosystem, plants, animals, or other human beings. In her analysis, she shows that the dualism of science and nature is thus not a disinterested distinction, so to speak, but a binary relationship of domination, where the dominated, here the living nature, is degraded to a merely passive inferior and thus generates typical hegemonic constructions of agency, with ethically far-reaching implications. For instance, this way of thinking has found explicit theoretical expression in the great chain of being hierarchy, also known as Scala Natura. Even without being openly expressed, this hierarchy of nature is still operative in numerous forms in various areas, often unconsciously. What we can learn from these feminist analyses of the scientific realism debate is that the underlying metaphysical question of the relationship between science and the world or nature has political significance insofar as it is ultimately based on hegemonic constructions of agency. According to this analysis, scientific realism and anti-realism have a common root, which lies in the dualistic conception of the relationship between an actively realistic discovering or anti-realistic constructing science and a passively understood object of knowledge as either mere resource or blank canvas. The solutions proposed by both Harvey and Plumwood ultimately aim at breaking with these productionist way of thinking by acknowledging nature's or the knowledge object's agency in the broad sense of their participation in knowledge production. That is, they understand science as a co-production between scientists and the objects of knowledge to which both the human scientists and the knowledge objects actively contribute. As I have argued in detail elsewhere, I believe that Harvey goes too far in her acknowledgement of the knowledge object's agency and ultimately falls into the ethically no less problematic trap of the flip side of hegemonic constructions of agency. However, I think that Harvey and Plumwood's analysis contains substantial insights into the political significance of the realism debate that can contribute to its fruitful reconceptualization. Combining the strengths of the pragmatic and feminist approaches, I will conclude with a positioned outline of such a reconceptualization of scientific realism and anti-realism as political stances. What I take to be one of the most significant contributions to the scientific realism debate of the pragmatic turn as outlined by Boucher and Forbes is first the consideration of meta-theoretical questions. This includes the question of the relevance of the debate as such. Is it a purely academic question, merely interesting to some philosophers of science, but in the end an idle metaphysical real, or does it have an impact on scientific theories and the theories of science? Answering this question depends, of course, highly on how we define scientific realism and anti-realisms. I think it is a woeful shortcoming of Boucher and Forbes' account here that they did not reflect upon this question, but blindly adopted a semantic definition of the scientific realism debate, which turns on the empiricist criterion of observability. This criterion ultimately defines reality in terms of the perceptibility and is therefore actually a criterion for something being empirical and not metaphysical, but not necessarily for something being real, existing, or even having spatio-temporal empirical effects. That is, to some extent, Boucher and Forbes stay within the naturalistic framework. I do not deny that observability can be an important criterion for evaluating and analyzing physical theories, but I do dispute that it is a criterion by means of which one can distinguish between realistic and anti-realistic positions or attitudes in a way that gives these positions any relevance outside physics and maybe chemistry. So if the debate about scientific realism is to be relevant in any sense, the corresponding positions must be formulated and defined in such a way that they are applicable to science as such. The more general and broader formulation in terms of the metaphysical question of whether or not or to what extent the world as it is investigated by the sciences is independent from human construction seems to me to be the better starting point here. So starting from this question of independence and thus the relation between science and its object, I think secondly, it is a merit of Horoway's and Plumwood's feminist philosophy of science who have shown that scientific realism debate is, or at least can be, politically and ethically relevant insofar as it turns on power-sensitive constructions of agency. Thirdly, I agree with Boucher and Forbes' view that the question of scientific realism, now understood as question of whether or not the sciences contribute to the discovery of a world largely independent from human constructions, cannot be resolved by quasi-scientific appeals to the empirical facts. That is, I endorse their view of scientific realism and anti-realisms as value-laden stances rather than factual beliefs. Contrary to Boucher and Forbes, however, I believe fourthly that we must set higher demands on these values. These demands follow Horoway's claim that ethics and politics provide the basis for objectivity in the sciences as a heterogeneous whole. That means A, that these values cannot be the personal and arbitrary values of an individual, but rather of a diverse scientific community, and B, that they encompass both but Longino called constitutive epistemic values and contextual, that is, cultural, political, ethical values. Adopting a realist political stance then means, for instance, to assume, based on an epistemological and political values, that one's object of research is independent or relatively independent from human constructions and has, in this sense, a human-independent agential role in the knowledge process. Adopting an anti-realist political stance conversely means that one's object of research is dependent or the result of human construction and, in this sense, has no human-independent agency. Grasped as such political stances, I finally also endorse the second part of the pragmatic turn, namely the pragmatic justification of realism and anti-realism, that is, the justification and assessment in terms of their practical, including epistemic and political ethical consequences for humans and their non-human environment, given the constitutive and contextual community relative values. Where my sketchy proposal of scientific realism and anti-realism as political stances differs from Horoway's account, is that other than Horoway, I do not think that we can evade a, to some extent, passive conception of our knowledge objects, and therefore cannot evade some position or stance within the realist anti-realist spectrum. Even if we acknowledge the object's agency and active contributions within knowledge production, the design, methodology, and evaluation of the respective research project is ultimately up to us. However, to acknowledge this is exactly a precondition of a power-sensitive science that does justice to its object, both epistemically and politically ethically. I will conclude by just naming a few examples of what scientific realism and anti-realism as political stances can look like in scientific practice, including the sciences concerned with that matter. Drawing on Horoway's philosophy of science and Niels Bohr's philosophy of physics, physicist and philosopher Karen Barad developed a position that she calls agential realism, which assumes that ontologically people and objects, including electrons, emerge only through their interactions with each other, and thus emphasizes that entities do not exist as separate individuals before they relate, but are formed through their connections and entanglements, including ethical and political connections. Boucher and Forbes cite Theodore Arabatsis representing electrons, which I have not read yet, but which, following their description, seems to me quite similar to Barat's agential realism. In his biographical history of the representation of the electron, Arabatsis allows elements of a realist outlook into his historiography of science so that he can treat the electron as an agent in its own right, not merely as a construction from theory, but rather as an autonomous participant in the practice of science that is able to resist changes to its theoretical characterization that some scientists would impose on it, and thereby ensure its own survival within physics despite radical shifts in scientific theory. An example for anti-realism as political stance could be a sociologist's studies on race, where race is conceived as human construct and thus without any human independent agential role, as a supposed race gene could be argued to have, which nonetheless is real and has profound empirical and material effects. These are just some examples of what my proposal of scientific realism and anti-realism as political stances can look like. While I do not claim that it is theoretically or practically relevant to every individual research project, I do hope that my proposal is at least in principle relevant to various sciences, as it is a stance or attitude towards the environment to fellow human beings, to the task in which one is engaged, to the fate one suffers. And that in turn is precisely, and given the course of my argument somewhat ironically, what Carnap understands by a Lebensgefühl, which metaphysics expresses. Thank you very much.